Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. It's Samuel Allred on the mic, and today we're going to talk about how to get a deer out of the woods. Now, if you're an experienced hunter, you may have your own processes or methods for getting a deer out of the woods, but especially for new hunters, I think it's helpful to think all the way through the hunting process. In media and podcasts these days, I think there's just not enough focus on what actually happens after the shot once you have a deer on the ground. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully it's helpful and gives you some ideas for this deer season. One more thing before we jump in. I'm using deer as an example, but these methods will really work for any animals, just depending on the size. Deer are universal to North America big game hunters, so it's a really good example that everybody can relate to, but don't think that you couldn't apply these to different animals if you wanted to. All right, the first method we're going to talk about is maybe the oldest, maybe the most common. It's just the good old deer drag. So you've shot your deer, you've given it some time to expire, you've tracked it, you've recovered it, maybe you field dressed it, and now you just grab the deer by the antlers and you drag it back to your truck. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a couple different ways you can do this. So if the deer has antlers, of course, just grab the antlers and pull it by its antlers. Those are pretty sturdy, and usually that's going to do the trick. If the deer doesn't have antlers, it really helps to have some rope and a stick. So then you just tie the rope around the deer's neck, and you then tie the other end of the rope to a stick and hold on to that stick as you drag the deer out. I like the stick method because I usually have parachute cord in my pack, and that can really cut into your hand or just bite into your hand. So wrapping it around a stick gives a nice handle that's a lot more comfortable. If you have a tarp or some sort of sled handy, that can also be a good way to drag a deer, especially in snow. Dragging deer in the snow on a sled is going to be much easier than just dragging the deer without one. The first time I dragged a deer, I was a little bit worried because I had already field dressed the deer. So there was a lot of meat exposed on the inside where I had pulled all the guts and stuff out of the deer. I was a little bit worried that dragging would get all that inside dirty, and then I would spoil meat or have to pick off the dirt later or clean it somehow. It turned out to be pretty much okay. The deer mostly stayed closed when I was dragging it, and I think that time I might have tied the legs together or something, but I found that as long as you take care when you're dragging, you can do a pretty good job to keep that body cavity clean, and you don't have to worry about it too much. I think that by field dressing the deer first, you are doing two things which are advantageous. One, you're making it lighter. It's surprisingly hard to drag a limp body, and if you think of how big a deer can get, in some places it could be just as much weight as you. So it can be quite challenging to drag a deer by yourself. Also, field dressing the deer and getting those guts out helps start the cooling process. And then you just leave the hide on and you can drag on the hide. That way your meat is protected, but you are still allowing the meat to start cooling, which will prevent spoilage. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of dragging your deer out of the woods. Well, like I said, it can be very challenging, especially with one person. If it's a big deer, or if it's uphill, or if it's a long ways, it can just be quite a task. So you can make that easier by dragging with a buddy, of course, but just depending on how far back you are, you may have a real task on your hands. It also sometimes, if you know that you don't want to drag your deer for miles and miles, it will prevent you from going into the spots where you need to go to kill deer. So that is one big disadvantage of dragging, is that if you need to go further back, or you need to go into a thick spot, or you need to go down a big hill, and you're thinking in the back of your mind, oh, I'm not going to be able to get this deer out, that can be a major disadvantage. It's also tough to drag a deer in an area that has lots of obstacles. So, if you're going to go through an area that has lots of blowdowns or deadfall, you're going to get tired of that real quick. Along with being challenging, dragging is also slow. I've had an instance where I was trying to get a deer, it was in the evening, and I was trying to get a deer to the processor before the processor closed. And so I was dragging this deer. It was going really slow, and I was really concerned that I wasn't going to be able to get it to the processor. Looking back, I probably had time. The temperatures were fine, but I didn't know that at the time. I thought I needed to get it there before it was going to just spoil on me. So that is another thing to keep in mind, is that it can take a long time. And then the last thing to consider when dragging is that, and this may not apply to deer so much as other animals like bears, where you might want to keep the hide. Dragging can rub the hide and create a bald spot, which would be undesirable in that situation. Okay, let's talk about some of the advantages of dragging an animal. First of all, it's straightforward. It doesn't really require any special equipment. Most people can drag a deer if they're physically strong enough, so it just gets points for the simplicity of it. Another advantage is that you get the deer out whole. Now, this can be a disadvantage or an advantage depending on what you want to do with the deer next, but there are some processors out there, if you're bringing your deer to a processor, who will only take the animal whole and will only take it hide on, this, that, and the other. So if you need to bring it out whole, dragging is a great way to go. Another thing is that in some states, there are requirements on how you bring a deer out. So some states, I believe, don't let you quarter or cut up a deer when you're bringing it out of the woods. So check your local regulations and make sure you know what you can do with the deer first. But dragging is usually a pretty safe option in that regard. All right, well, you probably didn't know there was that much to say about dragging a deer, but here we are. We'll move on to our next method. You guessed it, carrying a deer. There's two main ways to carry a deer. I'm saving using a backpack for later. And those are the one-man carry and the pole carry. So the one-man carry is just like it sounds. You get the deer onto your shoulders. You might need to lay down and then grab the legs of the deer and then kind of turn yourself over. And then you just hoof it out of there. You can also do something where you tie the front and back legs of the deer together to make two shoulder straps and then put the deer on like a backpack. And once again, you just have to be strong enough to be able to get up. Once you're on your feet, it will probably be a little bit easier and you can walk out of there with the deer on your back. The pole carry is a little bit more involved and requires two people. So first of all, you need a stout pole. So you might find a small tree and then cut off the branches with a hatchet or a saw. And then you have a long straight pole that you can put on your shoulder, and then your buddy goes in front of you and puts it on his shoulder. And then you tie the deer to the pole in between you. So when it's all said and done, you're going to have the deer with its back to the ground, and then you'll lift up the pole and the deer's legs will be tied so the deer is swinging in between you and your buddy from the pole. And then you can take that and you can hike out. The pole carry requires a little bit extra effort because you have to find that pole in the first place, but it might be a good method for if you have a hunting camp and you have a number of people who might be killing deer. So say you're going to be there for 5 days, 10 days. Well, go ahead and make that pole at the beginning of the week, and then you can just use that over and over again for different people's deer throughout the week. So now let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of carrying a deer. Well, first of all, carrying a deer by yourself can be just as challenging, if not more challenging, than dragging. So you have to be physically fit. Really depends on the size of the deer. So that's an obvious disadvantage for most people. Deer can be very unwieldy. Again, it's carrying a dead body. It's just dead weight. So that could be really challenging. Another thing that I've found with carrying dead animals is that you're very likely to get bloody. That's not the biggest issue, but sometimes it can be annoying. And so there's that. The two-man pole carry can be a little bit challenging to set up, just depending on if you can find that perfect pole. But once you do it, you will be able to keep the deer off the ground and be able to get over obstacles easier, which is kind of the major advantage of actually carrying a deer, is being able to get over obstacles and around things a little bit better than just trying to drag that deer and then flop it over obstacles when you come to them. And again, when you're carrying a deer, you're bringing the deer out whole, which can be great if you need to bring it to a processor whole, if it's required by local regulations, or if you want to hang your deer whole with the hide on to age it. The next method is using wheels. So when I say using wheels, I mean using something like a cart or a wagon. You can get these game carts that are kind of like a dolly with oversized off-road wheels and then lots of straps. And those can be real helpful because once you've killed your deer and recovered it, you can then go back to your truck and bring that game cart out, strap your deer onto the game cart, and then wheel it out. And it makes the whole process of getting a deer out by yourself a lot easier. A wagon is the same idea, just a different format. And a lot of these carts that are built for retrieving game are collapsible so that they can fold up and not take up too much space in your truck. A cart can be great just because it makes moving that deer so much easier. But there are a couple disadvantages. First of all, you probably won't bring your cart with you when you're hunting unless you know exactly where you're going to be hunting. So you might leave it in the truck, and that means there's an extra trip to the truck just to get your cart. Secondly, a cart can get caught up in brush easily, and it's only so useful over obstacles. So you may still have those moments where you have to unload the deer or kind of lever the cart over a log or something like that in order to get where you're going. And in thick brush, those wheels could get caught up in that thick brush. So a cart would probably be ideal for a situation where you have a road or established trail that you can wheel that cart on. All right, so now we've covered dragging, carrying, and using a cart, all pretty straightforward. That brings us to my favorite method for getting a deer out of the woods, and that is quartering the deer and packing it out. When I say quartering, I'm not actually referring to 4 exact quarters. I think quartering in a butchering sense is actually a halfway cut through the animal's ribs and then another linear cut through the pelvic bone all the way to the neck. When we talk about quartering in a hunting scenario, though, what we usually mean is cutting off each of the 4 legs up around what would be the shoulder joints, and then we will cut out the back straps of the animal, which would be along the spine on the back, grab the tenderloins from inside the body cavity, and then any other meat like rib meat and neck meat. So usually you'll actually end up with 5 bags. You'll have a quarter in each. That's what we call it. A quarter is a leg. A quarter in each bag, and then the extra meat in another bag. I like to quarter deer out in the field for a couple of reasons. First of all, it starts the cooling process immediately. So as you break down the deer into smaller pieces, it allows for more airflow around the meat, and that helps to cool it off. And in the long term, that will create a better product at the dinner table. You'll also find that even good-sized deer, once you've taken the hide off and you've quartered them out, you'll find that you can actually fit them into a pretty reasonable amount of space. So if you have a large backpack, once you've quartered out that deer, you have the 4 quarters and then the additional meat, you may find that you can put it into your backpack pretty easily and pack it out. Once you've quartered the deer, you've dropped a significant amount of weight, being the entrails and the hide, and it's a lot easier to manage that deer now that it's broken down a little bit. Also, if you have any interest in processing the deer yourself, which I highly recommend, it's super interesting and fun, and you can make all the cuts exactly how you want them. Once you've quartered it, you're well on your way to breaking it down further in the processing phase. Another advantage of quartering an animal is that if you need to hang up the quarters, say you're going to stay the night or you need to come back for the animal, it's a lot easier to hang up quarters in a tree than it is to hang an entire animal. I've tried hanging an animal with parachute cord and it worked, but the parachute cord stretches and then it cuts into your hand and it's not ideal. It works, but it's not ideal. So it's a lot easier to manage those quarters and those bags individually. For this method, you will need to understand how to quarter a deer. It's not that hard, especially once you've done it once or twice, but you may need to look up some videos or find someone who can help teach you how to quarter a deer. And then you will also need some game bags and you will need a big backpack. I've used a backpacking backpack for whitetail. It has about 65 liters of capacity. I think that's around 3,900 cubic inches. And that's worked for medium-sized whitetail. If you had a real big monster, maybe you'd need to make 2 trips, but a decent-sized backpack is probably all you need. You could also use a pack frame or a pack with a meat shelf or something like that. So let's talk about the pros and cons of quartering an animal and packing it out. Well, it does take a little bit more skill. It's a little bit more labor intensive. You won't get the animal out whole, and if it was a real monster buck, it might require a couple of trips. But what I really like about quartering an animal and packing it out is that it just gives me the freedom to go and hunt anywhere I want. With a deer drag or a cart, I might feel restricted in how far into the backcountry I go or into what sort of terrain I go because I know it's going to be hard to get the animal out. With a backpack, I know that I can just quarter the animal up and go ahead and put it in that backpack and I can hike it out. And as long as I do my part of being physically fit, I will be able to go pretty much anywhere I want to go. With a reasonable load in your backpack, you have arguably the greatest maneuverability, and you can get over obstacles that would be really challenging when dragging the deer or trying to use a cart. Lastly, the deer is already cut up and ready for you to put in your refrigerator, and then you can go ahead and start processing that deer just as soon as you want. So those are the main ways to get a deer out of the woods. There are certainly other ways, and it's really only limited by your creativity, but I hope hearing some of these methods helps give you an idea of what might work in your hunting situation. One common theme that I have noticed as I've been thinking about this subject is that you need a certain level of physical fitness to do any of these methods. So I would encourage you to go ahead and start walking with a backpack, lifting at the gym, doing something to help increase your physical fitness and strength. And I think your body will thank you when you are successful. All right, well, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. I hope this was helpful for you. And until next week, happy hunting.